Hey everyone, so you joined me out on this beautiful Northern Irish morning and I'm just capturing some footage with my DJI Mini 4 Pro, and I thought this would be a great time to do a refresher on the settings I'm using to get the best results from this drone. You see, the DJI Mini 4 Pro came out way back in September 2023. I had to do a double take when I checked that it really doesn't feel that long. And in that time, this drone's had a ton of firmware updates, but also my own personal preferences in regards to settings have changed. Now, drone settings are a personal thing, I'm fully aware. So if you do use these settings, it doesn't immediately guarantee you're going to get great results from this drone. You have to work out what settings work best for you, but these should serve as a great starting point. Now, I'm going to try and keep this video nice and short, nice and concise. By not diving into each individual setting, I'm only going to concentrate on the most important ones. If you want to find out about all the different settings you can adjust on this drone, then I highly recommend checking out my full beginner's guide where I dive into tons of detail on each of the settings menus, and I'll put a link to that in the description down below. In saying that, you guys know me, this is my jam, and when I start talking about settings, I can get carried away, so forgive me if I do. But I'm going to break this video down into 3 chunks. We'll first focus on the video settings, then the photo settings, and then lastly, the flight settings. Let's jump right in. And let's start with the video settings. Now, nowadays, being completely honest, I have 2 different modes, 2 different mindsets when I'm heading out to capture footage with my drone. And the first mindset I might be in is when I just want to go out, have fun flying my drone, and capture clips that are more than good enough for social media without having to worry about dialing in the settings, working with filters, or even editing the footage after I've got it off the drone. Let's call it easy mode. The second mode or mindset I might be in is when I want to wring the highest quality possible from the DJI Mini 4 Pro. Maybe I'm heading to somewhere special, an epic location, and I want to spend that extra time dialing in the settings, working with filters, making sure the composition is right, and even editing the footage afterwards to get the highest quality possible. And depending on which mindset I'm in, the settings will be different. So let's start with that first mindset, easy mode. And I honestly think for 90% of people, these are more than ideal, because if you are only going to upload your footage to Instagram, YouTube, then you're still going to get great results using these settings. So the first thing we want to change is the resolution. So let's tap Res and FPS on the bottom right of the controller screen. And you obviously want to set this to 4K to get the highest resolution possible. For frame rate, I recommend setting this to 30 FPS. Now, the reason for that is social media websites such as Instagram actually recommend a minimum of 30 FPS for smooth playback. So since that's where the majority of our clips are going to end up, and we want them to play back smoothly, that is the FPS I use. And you can always slow a 30 FPS clip down to 24 or 25 FPS, and this actually looks quite nice. You get a subtle slow motion effect, so you get the best of both worlds when you use 30 FPS. Now, for exposure, if we're in easy mode, I just leave it set to auto. The drone does a great job. However, there is 2 little tweaks you want to make. The first thing I have found is if it's a bright sunny day like today, and you're using auto exposure mode, the drone tends to slightly overexpose the highlights. You'll often see little areas of your sky are blown out. So to prevent that, I recommend tapping this EV icon on the bottom right of the controller screen and lowering this to -0.3. That's the exposure compensation. And it basically tells the drone to ever so slightly expose darker than it thinks it should, and this helps protect those highlights. The second thing you must do is before you hit record, press and hold on the screen until you see auto exposure locked appear. And this now means as you fly the drone around capturing footage, that exposure won't be adjusting and changing, and you won't get these jarring shifts in your footage. Now, there's 1 or 2 other settings I want to look at in the camera settings menu. So let's tap the 3 white dots at the top right of the controller screen, and then under the camera subheading, the first option you will see is the color mode. Now, if we're in easy mode, I want footage I can use straight from the drone. I don't want to have to worry about color grading it. And for that reason, I leave this set to normal, and you'll get beautiful footage that you can use straight from the drone. For coding format, I leave this set to H.265. It has a higher compression efficiency, which in simple terms means the file sizes will be smaller. And in the next option, if we scroll down, that I recommend turning on is the grid lines. Now, this will be personal preference, but I like to use the grid line and the center point, as you can use the grid for framing your shots by using composition techniques such as the rule of thirds, and the center point is fantastic for making sure your subject is centered when you're doing drone moves around it. Now, scrolling down, I recommend keeping the white balance set to auto. Again, the drone does a great job. And lastly, If you tap the down arrow next to the style options, I highly recommend going in and lowering the sharpness to -1. You see, out of the box, I find the footage that comes from the DJI Mini 4 Pro is slightly too sharp. It has that digital over-sharpened look to it. So to help fix that, you can lower the sharpness to -1, and this makes the footage look that little bit more natural. Okay, so those are the settings I use if I'm in easy mode. And honestly, with little to no effort, you can get fantastic results using these settings. But what if I wanted to get the highest quality possible from this drone? Well, let's now look at what I'm going to call my highest quality mode settings. And we'll go through together and make some adjustments. And the biggest change I will make when I want to get the best quality from this drone is I will change to use manual exposure mode. And you can do that by tapping this auto icon on the bottom right of the controller screen. And then we need to go in and manually adjust the ISO and shutter speed, which you can do by tapping on top of the ISO and shutter speed on the bottom right of the controller screen, and then the menu will open up. Now you want to make sure to turn off the auto button next to ISO and shutter so that we can manually control these. Now the ISO controls your camera's sensitivity to light, and a low ISO, like 100 or 200, will keep your image clean and noise free, while a higher ISO brightens the image but does add grain and reduces quality. So you always want to try to keep your ISO as low as possible for the best image. So if you're outside on a nice sunny day like today, that means keeping it at 100. But if you are filming in lower light situations, you will need to increase this, but just be aware you will start adding noise and grain to your footage. Now below this, you will see the shutter speed setting, but what is shutter speed? Well, the shutter speed essentially controls how long the drone's camera sensor is exposed to light for each frame that makes up your footage. And in video, this directly affects motion blur. The lower the shutter speed, the more natural motion blur you get, and the higher it is, the sharper and more choppy movement will look in your footage. Now for the smoothest and most cinematic look, you want to follow something called the 180-degree shutter rule. And this means setting your shutter speed to double your frame rate. So as we're recording at 30 FPS, your shutter speed should be set to 1/60. Now, don't worry, I know what you're thinking. You're looking at the camera preview while I'm explaining this and thinking, are you sure that's right, Matthew? Have you looked at the camera preview? Your image is completely overexposed. It's all white and you can barely make anything out. Surely these settings can't be right. Well, here's the thing. In bright conditions, using a lower shutter speed lets in too much light, making your footage completely overexposed. And this is where ND filters come in. Think of them like sunglasses for your drone's camera. They are dark pieces of glass that when placed in front of that camera, reduce the amount of light hitting the sensor so that you can keep that perfect shutter speed and get natural looking motion blur even on a sunny day. Now, another setting I recommend changing if you're looking to get the highest quality possible from the DJI Mini 4 Pro and you're willing to put a little bit more work in is the color mode. I highly recommend you change this to D-Log M, and that's because D-Log M is a flatter color profile that better preserves the highlights and shadows, giving you much more flexibility when it comes to color grading the footage. And once color graded, you can end up with a clip that has a higher dynamic range than if you just used the normal color mode. Just be aware though, you will need to color grade this footage before you can use it. Now when you go back to the camera preview, you will see that this has also made the camera preview use that flat color profile, and this can make it quite hard to visualize what your final clip will look like once you've color graded it. So to help with that, I highly recommend going back to the settings menu and turning on color display assist. And this will add saturation and contrast back to the camera preview. Now it's important to note you will still only get that flat footage saved to the storage of your drone that you will need to color grade. This doesn't apply any saturation or contrast to that. It's only overlaying it over the camera preview to help you better visualize what your footage will look like once you've finally color graded it. Now the last setting I highly recommend you change if you're looking to get the highest quality footage from the DJI Mini 4 Pro is the white balance. You don't want to leave this set to auto, as that means you might see fluctuations in color temperatures as you move the drone around, and this won't look very professional. So I highly recommend you change this to manual. But what should you set the color temperature to? Well, here's a really cool trick where you can have the drone work out the perfect manual white balance setting for you without having to think too much about it. So what you first want to do is set this back to auto and then frame your shot exactly how you want to capture it. So I framed this small little building, for example. Now what the drone's doing now is working out the perfect white balance for this scene. And once it's done that, if you go back to the settings menu and change this to manual, you've now logged that correct color temperature in, and now it won't shift as you fly the drone around. Alternatively, if you don't want to use this trick, in daytime, I generally set the color temperature to between 5500 Kelvin and 5700 Kelvin, depending on the lighting, because that is essentially daylight. So those are the settings I use depending on the two different modes I might be in when I'm heading out flying. Which mode do you think suits you more? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, just quickly, I know I say this in all my videos, but if you are getting value from this video, please let me know by giving me the thumbs up and clicking that like button down below. And if you love all things drones, but also action cameras, gimbals and more, and want to learn about the best settings to get up and running quickly, along with tips and tricks to help you get more cinematic videos and better looking images with your gear, then please consider clicking that subscribe button down below. And when you're down there, be sure to check the notification bell so that you will be alerted when my new videos are released. It would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's now quickly take a look at the photo settings. So let's switch into photo mode. You can capture some beautiful images with the DJI Mini 4 Pro. It really is impressive. Now for the exposure, I just leave this set to auto when I'm capturing photos with this drone. It works fantastically, but I do keep the exposure compensation set to -0.3, again, just to protect those highlights. Now for the photo format, which you can access by tapping this format icon on the bottom right of the screen, I recommend setting this to JPEG and RAW. That way, whenever you capture an image, you get the best of both worlds. You get a JPEG version, which is ready to go straight from the drone, should you wish to upload it to social media quickly without any editing, but you also get a RAW photo. Now, a RAW photo contains much more data and information, allowing you much more flexibility when editing, allowing you to recover highlights and shadows better. So should you wish to spend time editing your images, you will have a RAW image that you can use. Now, tapping the 3 by dots on the top of the controller screen again, and going back under the camera subheading, there's two other options I recommend changing. The first is the aspect ratio. I recommend setting this to 4:3. That way you capture an image with the full size of the drone's camera sensor. And this also gives you a bit more verticality, which is really useful should you need to reframe your images in your image editor. Now below this, you will see the resolution setting. And for most cases, I recommend setting this to 48 megapixels, as that will give you an image with a higher resolution and more detail. The only caveat is if you're capturing photos in lower light situations, such as sunrise, sunset or nighttime, I recommend dropping this down to 12 megapixels, as in my testing, I have found that 48 megapixel option does start to introduce more noise and grain to the photos when capturing images in lower light. But for all other situations, I recommend keeping this set to 48 megapixels. Now, when it comes to getting smooth movements with your DJI Mini 4 Pro, arguably the most important settings menu you want to look at is something called the Gain and Expo tuning, and it's located under the control subheading. Now, when I tap into this, you can see there is a lot of settings. And if I was to dive into detail about what each one did, this video would take all day. So I'm not going to do that. But essentially what you can do in here is you can adjust things like the max speed at which the drone can fly, its max rotation speed. You can increase the smoothness settings, which essentially acts like a buffer. So normally when you let your finger off the joystick when you're moving the drone, it will come to an immediate stop. But if you increase the smoothness settings, when you let off that joystick, the drone will actually buffer out that movement. And this can really help you get smoother movements if you struggle with being nice and steady on the joysticks. You can also adjust something called the Expo, which is essentially how quickly the drone reacts as you push the joystick further and further away from its center point, and you can adjust the gimbal settings. Now, if I scroll back up, you can also see that you can adjust these settings for each individual flight mode, Cine, Normal, and Sport. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to put the settings I use on the screen so that you can pause the video or make a note to put them into your own controller. And I'm just going to go through what way I've set up each flight mode. So let's start with Cine mode. And I use this to get nice, slow, cinematic shots. 95% of the time when I'm capturing drone footage, I'm using Cine mode. Now, the adjustments I've made for the Cine mode is essentially slowing the drone down a little bit. I've added a bit of rotational smoothness to buffer out some of that movement when I'm turning the drone. And I've made the joysticks less sensitive towards their center point to make it easier to do drone moves. I've also slowed the gimbal down a little bit and added some smoothness to it. Now, normal mode on the other hand, I'll use when I'm flying the drone high in the air, but still want to capture footage with it. You see, when you leave the drone in Cine mode at higher altitudes, the drone often moves so slow, it doesn't really convey motion. So in those instances, I will use normal mode. And with my settings, all I've done is slow the normal mode down a tiny bit, and I've also added a tiny amount of smoothness to the rotation and gimbal movement. Now lastly is sport mode, and I use this essentially for just getting my drone into location quickly and framing my shots fast. So what I've done with my settings is speed up the rotation movement, so again I can get the drone into position really quickly, added a tiny bit of smoothing, and I've made the gimbal move much faster, so again I can quickly point it at my subject. Alright, so going back out of that menu, if you scroll down all the way to the bottom of the control menu, you will see an option called button customization. And in here you can customize what the 2 function buttons on the back of the DJI RC2 controller do, or the single function button on the front of the DJI RC N2 controller. That's the controller you attach your phone to. Now the way I've customized these is I've set my C1 button to A lock on or off. That means if I'm in auto exposure mode, like I am now, instead of having to press and hold the screen to lock the exposure, I can simply just press that C1 button, and now the exposure is locked. And this is a much faster way of locking the exposure, as it means I can do it while I'm flying the drone around, as I don't need to take my fingers off the joysticks to press and hold on the controller screen. The C2 button on the other hand, I've set to cruise control. An unbelievably useful feature that essentially acts like the cruise control feature on your car, allowing you to start a drone movement with the drone, and then once you're happy with that movement, you can turn on cruise control, and now you can take your fingers off the joysticks and it will continue to do that move without you touching the controller in any way. Now the last feature I want to show you is something I've started using quite a lot if I'm flying the drone in a tighter space or somewhere with a lot of obstacles. And it's a feature that was recently added to the Vision Assist function. Now to access Vision Assist, you want to bring up the mini-map on the bottom left of the controller screen and then swipe on it until this Vision Assist window opens. Now if you don't know, what this essentially allows you to do is see a black and white feed out of the vision sensors dotted around the drone, so you can actually look in a different direction than the drone's camera is facing. So if I fly left, for example, you can now see I'm seeing out of the left side of the drone, and this is really useful for spotting obstacles. But a new feature that was recently added with a firmware update is the fact you can now press and hold on this Vision Assist window and it will pop out, and now you can place it anywhere on the screen, which means not only can I keep that Vision Assist window open, but I can also use the radar compass on the bottom left of the screen, so I have a ton of information available to me. And this is just a super useful feature that I highly recommend you use. So there you have it. Those are all the settings I'm currently using to get the best results from this drone. And if you have found this video helpful or useful, please let me know by giving me the thumbs up and clicking that like button down below. Now, if you would like to learn even more about the DJI Mini 4 Pro, then I have a video going over the 5 tips that I think make it even better that I highly recommend checking out by clicking up here or by using the link in the description down below.